Hello, Zora. I've finally gotten around to making another educational video for you. Now, if you look behind me, you can see my biggest fan. Anyway, I had promised last time, actually the time before last, that I would talk a little bit about Native American Indian culture, and taken me a couple of weeks, but now I'm ready to go. Are you ready? Well, then let's go. All right. Well, here we go then. A long time ago, before the European colonists had come across the ocean to North America, before there were countries named the United States of America or Canada or Mexico, the whole of North America was occupied by Native American Indians, and they were in tribal groups. And we talked before about what tribes are and what clans are. Well, just in what is today the United States, there were hundreds and hundreds of different tribes. And each tribe had their own way of doing things. Most of them had their own language. I say most of them. Maybe sometimes there were two or three tribes that spoke similar languages. But for the most part, had their own language, they had their own religion, they had their own way of doing things. Now, there were some things, though, that many tribes had in common. There are some things, and we'll talk about those later, that no matter which part of North America you lived in, if you were a Native American Indian, you would probably do things along the lines of a certain way. And that was true also in Europe. And we'll talk about those later. But there were other things that were greatly different from tribe to tribe. A lot of times it depended on what region or what part of North America you were in. And this map here is a map of the different tribal regions. You can see the northeast, that's up there on the upper right in the dark green, and the southeast below that in the light green. Both of those sometimes are called the eastern woodland tribes. And then you've got other regions like the southwest and so forth. Well, if you were a member of a tribe that lived, let's say, in the region of the southeast, even though every tribe was different and every tribe has their own way of doing things, you'd probably have more in common with other tribes in the southeast than you would with, say, someone from the southwest. And remember, each of these regions had probably hundreds of tribes. All right, but like I said, there were some things that most regions even had in common. What we're going to do now is we're going to go through all these different regions, these different parts of the continent, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about each one. In addition to telling you a little bit about each region, I'm also going to mention two different tribes from each region. I might get all excited and mention three, but I'll try to control myself because, if I mention too many, it's easy to lose track and get confused. But I'll mention at least two so you'll have an idea of what some of the tribes were in each of those regions. All right? Well, let's start with the first region. And that first region that we're going to look at is the Northeast Woodland region, part of the Eastern Woodland region, along with the Southeast. So the Northeast there, that includes what is now New England and down into New York and New Jersey. And it also includes the tribes who lived around the Great Lakes. And there are the Great Lakes, great big huge lakes. And some examples include the Mohawk tribe, who lived in what is now New York, and the Illini tribe, who lived in what is now Illinois. In fact, they're what Illinois was named for. Well, tribes in the Northeast made their living by either fishing, especially if they lived there along the beaches there by the ocean, or if they lived by those Great Lakes, and by hunting. And they would hunt whatever animals were in the area, but mostly it was deer. Mostly it was deer that they lived off of. And they lived in houses that were made out of straw, usually straw and grass, that several of the tribes that spoke Algonquin languages, and many of the tribes in this region spoke those languages, called these little houses wigwams. The next region, the southeast, is very similar to the northeast. They also, they did fishing if they lived near the ocean. They also fished in rivers, and they hunted. And just like in the northeast, mostly it was deer that they hunted. And they also did a lot of farming. And I forgot to mention this when I was talking about the northeast. Both those regions, the people did a lot of farming. And this picture here is a Cherokee village. So the Cherokees, they're one example of a southeast tribe. The Choctaws are another example. This one, you can see right there in the middle, this big round building is called a council house. And later on, we will talk about what those council houses were and how they worked. But you'll see there, here's some guys carrying in a deer that they caught that they're going to eat. And they're going to also take the deer's skin, its hide, and its fur and make things out of it. But you can also see the cornfield. Now, in every town and village for those tribes in both the northeast and the southeast, for every town there was a big cornfield. And everybody took turns working in the big cornfield, or they all worked in it together. And then when the corn was ready, then everybody in the town shared the corn. So everyone got however much their family was going to need. And then they took some of what was left over and put it in a storage building. And then if anyone else wound up needing more corn than they thought they would, they could just go and get it. So that was a very common way of doing things. And here's something else that was common. Well, I'm going to tell you about it. This is a painting of a Cherokee village in Tennessee, actually not far from where I live. And this is how most villages, not just Cherokee, but other tribes in the southeast region were laid out. And in addition to everything else, they all had a ball field. And that circled area there, that's where the ball field is. You can see some people there who are getting ready to play ball. And you'll notice that there's a couple of poles there. Well, these were usually located right in the middle of town. And the game that they played, which is called stickball, was and still remains a very important game. They loved playing it. They still love to play it. Now, among the Cherokees, the way that it's still played is that those poles that you saw there, each one has a wooden fish on top of it. And the way that you score points is for someone on your team to throw the ball up there and hit that wooden fish and make it spin around. Then your team got a point. But you can't pick it up and throw it with your hands. You have to throw it with a stick. That's why it's called stickball. And you can see a picture of some of the sticks, such as are still used. It's a stick that's got a net on the end of it, and you catch the ball in that net, and then you sling it through the air. And here's some Cherokees on the right there, dressed up like old-timey Cherokees from a long time ago, and they're playing ball. Now, all the tribes in the South played this game. In the Northeast region, they also played the game, But there was one big difference in how they played it in the Northeast as opposed to the Southeast, and that is they had much bigger sticks with bigger nets. And here's a couple of paintings of Mohawks playing that version of the game, which later came to be called lacrosse. And people still play lacrosse all the time, whether they're Native American Indians or not. In fact, here's a guy from the Illinois lacrosse team. But it was invented by the native people of this area. The next region we're going to talk about is the Plains, also called the Great Plains. The Plains are an area that is really, really flat and kind of dry. It's covered in grass. It's not a desert, but it is still kind of dry. Now, I said they're kind of flat, but in this picture you can see this Plains tribe in this village that there's mountains in the background. So this picture has got to be of the northern plains near the Black Hills, which is about the only place on the plains you can find big mountains like that. For the most part, everything's just flat. A couple of examples of tribes are the Lakota, also known as the Sioux, and the Cheyenne. And they lived in what are called teepees, and you can see several of them there. It's basically a tent stretched over some long poles, and the tent is made out of animal hide. And you can see this woman there. She has got an animal hide stretched out and pegged to the ground so that it will dry out faster. And something that was interesting about their towns and villages is they didn't stay in the same place. They were made out of these tents that were real easy to take down and just basically carry with you and take somewhere else. Now, they didn't do a whole lot of fishing except in rivers, and there were a lot fewer varieties of animals for them to hunt. They would catch, what they could. They would hunt deer, for example, but there weren't as many on the plains because it's so dry. So on the plains, what those tribes hunted and lived on was the bison, sometimes called the buffalo. And here's a big old shaggy buffalo right there. And they lived in huge herds with thousands and thousands of buffalo in a herd. And that's why the villages of the Plains tribes weren't permanent, because they followed the buffalo herds. So when the buffalo herd moved, they'd pick up their town and move with it so they could catch some more buffalo. But there were so many buffalo, there was no danger of running out of them because there were way more buffalo than there were people. And just like the tribes that we talked about before, they would not just eat the meat, but they would use every part of the buffalo. Now, before Europeans came, there were no horses in North America. The Europeans brought horses with them, and the native people got horses from them. So before they had horses, it was a lot harder to catch buffalo on foot. Once they got horses, then more tribes moved on to the plains and made their living hunting buffalo that way. The next region we'll talk about is the Southwest, which is even drier than the plains and much, much hotter than the plains. It's also called the Desert Southwest. I don't know if you've ever heard of a desert before, but a desert is a place where it's really hot most of the time, although it can sometimes get really cold at night. And there's not a lot of green, not a whole lot of plants, cactus, some plants, but a lot of sand and a lot of rocks. Examples of tribes who live in the Southwest are the Navajo and the Hopi, who live very close together. And another example is the Apaches, who live in the West. Now, they're farmers. They also grow corn, although it's maybe a little harder to grow, but they grow it, and they hunt what they can. They don't live in teepees. They or well, the Plains Indians don't live in teepees anymore. Nowadays, they live in regular houses. But traditionally, the southwestern tribes didn't live in teepees or wigwams, but rather they made their houses out of baked clay bricks called adobe. And there's an example of an adobe house right there. And a long time ago, some of them even carved houses into the side of a mountain. This is at a place called Mesa Verde. And there's a long abandoned city there that has been carved out of the side of a mountain. And people lived up in there for a long time. And then they left and moved back down to the level ground. And we think that's because there was a drought. A drought is when it doesn't rain for a long time, and it made it really hard for them to stay up in the side of that mountain with no access to water. The next region is the northwest coast, that's also sometimes called the Pacific Northwest because it's right there by the Pacific Ocean. And you can see there in the map, it's a real long strip along the coast, that long blue strip there that goes from the northwest part of the U.S. all the way along the edge of Canada and up into Alaska. A couple of examples of tribes include the Tlingit and the Salish. The tribes that lived in the northwest did a lot of fishing out on the ocean, and you can see some of the boats. They had really, really long boats that a lot of people could fit in, and they would go out onto the sea and catch not just fish, but otters, sometimes seals. Sometimes they would even hunt whales up there, and they also hunted animals on the land because they were right there. It was really mountainous, and there were a lot of different kinds of animals. They had a very distinctive art style, by which I mean no one else had a style like it. And if you see that style, you can usually tell that comes from a Northwest tribe. And here, this picture of a Northwest village has got these poles. You'll notice outside each house, there's this big tall pole with a lot of faces and other artwork on it. This is called a totem pole. And it was only tribes in the Pacific Northwest, and also some people that lived on islands in the Pacific Ocean that used totem poles. Now what this is each one of these heads on the pole shows you where the people who live in that house, where they fit in the town and in the tribe. At the very top would always be a picture of the god that they worshipped, and a lot of times these totem poles will have figures with beaks and wings on top because they believed that the raven was one of the most sacred animals. So first it tells what religion they were, then it tells what tribe they were below that, and then below that it tells what clan they were, and below that it tells what town they live in, and below that it tells what family of the clan in that town they are. So someone from a different tribe that also practiced using these poles could come into your town. If, for example, you were Salish, they could come into your town and go to your house and look at that pole and know exactly who you were, exactly who your family was, who your clan was, and all that stuff. The next region is the Great Basin region, and that's way up in the Rocky Mountains. And tribes there included the Paiute and the Shoshone. They lived in grass houses, and they didn't hunt buffalo because the buffalo didn't go up into the mountains. But instead, what they mostly ate was bighorn sheep. There's one. There's one right there. And then above the Great Basin region is the Plateau region, and that included tribes like the Nez Perce and the Cayuse. Now, the Plateau region is right in between the plains and the northwest coast, and it's right next to the Great Basin region. And actually, the culture of those tribes kind of was a little bit of all those others. You'll notice I got the same picture. Their villages looked very similar to the Great Basin villages. They had the same kind of houses, but they sort of lived in some ways also similar to the Northwest Coast Indians. They would make their way out to the coast sometimes and fish, but they would also go out onto the plains sometimes and hunt buffalo. So they were just kind of like, a little bit of everything. There were a lot of tribes in California because it's right there by the ocean, and it was covered with lots and lots of forests. So there were plenty of animals, and well, with access to the ocean, fish, and one of the things that made the California Indians a little different from other regions is that they didn't do a lot of farming. They didn't grow corn like they did in most of the other regions. Instead, because everything was covered with woods, their main food in their diet that they made bread out of and other things was acorns. They just go out in the woods, and there were so many trees that you could just get lots and lots and lots of acorns, and you could grind them up and make flour out of them. The next region that we'll look at, and the biggest region, is the subarctic. It's there in that sort of pale green that covers most of Canada, all the way up into a large part of Alaska. Now, it's called the subarctic. Sub means under, so it's under the Arctic. And sure enough, you can see on the map, it is. The Arctic is up by the North Pole, the Arctic Circle, up there where it gets really, 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 really cold and stays that way most of the time, if not all the time. And then that's the North Pole. The Antarctic is the South Pole, where Antarctica is. Anyway, the subarctic, it's really cold, but it's not cold all the time. The winters have a lot of snow, and they're very long, much longer than the winters that we're used to. And when summer comes, the snow melts, but it never gets real hot. It's kind of mild. It's not really cold, but it's like 60, 70 degrees instead of 100 degrees. So a couple of the tribes that live up there are the Gwich'in, who live way up in the north part, up into Alaska, and the Cree, who actually live right around where it says subarctic. And they have, or they used to, sometimes they still do, when they go hunting, they had these houses that were similar to teepees, but heavier hides, and they used sled dogs, and still do. And a lot of their living is made by hunting, not buffalo, because there were no buffalo that far north where it got that cold, but rather caribou. And here is a caribou, which kind of looks similar to a deer, but they kind of acted similar to buffalo in that there would be, and still are, really big herds of them. And the villages would kill these caribou, go hunting and kill them and use every part of them. And they were very important and still are to those people's culture. And then when you get up into the Arctic, like I just said, it is very, very cold. So the Arctic stretches from Alaska, which is right there where the arrow is on the left, all along the coast, all along the upper part there of Canada. A couple of tribes in that area are the Inuit and the Yupik. The Yupik live right around where that arrow is pointing on the left in Alaska. The Inuit, there are Inuit all along the whole rest of it, all the way over to the east. Some people call both Inuits and Yupiks Eskimos, so you may have heard that term. Many of the native people though don't like that term Eskimo. They prefer to be called by their name for themselves. So really cold up there, stays cold. In fact, as you get up into the Arctic, it's days and nights get kind of strange. It's daytime for about 6 months, and then it's nighttime for about 6 months. So when the sun finally goes down, it's going to be down. It's kind of hard to keep track of what time it is. Also, folks in the Arctic traditionally built houses made out of ice, blocks of ice called igloos. Maybe you've heard of those. These are the people that built those, and like a lot of the people that we've talked about, well, all the people we talked about really so far, they're still around. They don't live exactly the way that their ancestors used to live, and they don't always dress the way their ancestors used to dress, just like we don't. You know, if you look at really, really old pictures, people dressed very differently. Sometimes, some of the photographs that I've shown, it's modern day people from those tribes that mostly just dress like everybody else, but sometimes, maybe on special occasions, dress the same way that their ancestors did. The final region we'll talk about is Mesoamerica, which means Middle America. And on the main map there on the left, it's not in the middle. It's all the way at the bottom, and you can barely see any of it. That's why I put this other map on the right so that you can see just how far Mesoamerica goes. It's most of Mexico and then parts of several other smaller countries that are in what is known as Central America. Central America is that narrow strip of land that connects North America and South America. And people that lived in that area include Aztecs and Mayans, who had both of those groups built really big cities and had these huge buildings called pyramids. Now they don't live in those cities anymore because the Europeans came along, the Spanish in this case, and took them away. And now those buildings, the ones that are left, are parts of parks where you can go and visit. But the descendants of the people are still around, and you can see several of them here, dressed like their ancestors. This guy over here on the left, but as you can see, these schoolgirls don't really, every day dress like that. However, they are still there, and they're in the news a lot because they really do a lot of work, like Native American Indians throughout the rest of North America, trying to protect the environment, especially trying to protect the forests and to protect water. All right, well, we've talked a little bit now about where Native American people lived and in some cases still live. Next, we'll talk about how. I'll see you soon.